Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, hello. My name is Laura Track. I am a lawyer with the BC Human Rights Clinic at the Community Legal Assistance Society. Thank you for the invitation to present. I will be speaking with you about human rights in BC, which is a subject near and dear to my heart and my full-time job here at the Human Rights Clinic at CLAS. And I'll probably speak for half an hour-ish, and then I'll take any questions that folks may have. So I was asked to speak a bit about human rights and a bit about the clinic and the work that we do, so that folks are aware of some of the protections that we have from discrimination in BC, as well as one of the resources that's out there for these kinds of issues if they arise. So I'll start with our clinic. The Human Rights Clinic is part of the Community Legal Assistance Society, or CLAS for short. CLAS has been around for 50 years. We just had our 50-year anniversary, and we provide free legal services to people in a range of different areas. We have a few different programs, including a mental health law program, a program that assists people who've experienced sexual harassment in the workplace. That's called Sharp Workplaces. And we have our Human Rights Clinic as one program of CLAS. The Human Rights Clinic is a province-wide service. We are physically located in downtown Vancouver on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, which is where I'm joining you from today. Our physical office is downtown, but we do serve people regardless of where they are in BC. We can provide remote services by phone and email and Zoom, and do our very best to make our services as broadly available as we can. We have a range of different services available at the Human Rights Clinic, including a phone line that is staffed Monday to Friday, where people can get some basic information about how human rights are protected and what the process looks like for making a complaint. We also run a short service clinic, which operates every Monday, all day on Monday, as well as on Wednesday evenings. And that provides half-hour appointments with a lawyer or a legal advocate to get some more specific, tailored advice and guidance about a situation that you might be experiencing. We also have lawyers and legal advocates who represent people who have made human rights complaints at the BC Human Rights Tribunal. If someone has made a human rights complaint, they can apply for legal representation from our clinic, and we do our very best to provide that service to as many people as we can. All of our services are free, and all of our services, legal services at least, are for people who've made complaints or are thinking about making complaints. We don't provide representation to employers or landlords or other service providers who might find themselves on the other side of a human rights complaint. We also do education workshops. So we do presentations and trainings and seminars on human rights and help people understand both their rights and their responsibilities under human rights law. So we do workshops for employers and landlords and other service providers to help them understand what the law requires them to do, in the hopes that by informing people about human rights law and how it works and what their obligations are, that we can avoid the discrimination that so often leads to complaints. That's our website there, bchrc.net. And sometimes when I do presentations like this, people find that they have some questions that they'd like to discuss about their own particular situation. I can't give you legal advice in a workshop like this, and I would respectfully request that you please don't share private details or information about a situation that you might be experiencing. I just can't give you guidance about that and what you should do in a public workshop like this. But you can go to our website, you can make an appointment with our short service clinic. That's exactly what it exists to do, is hear your story and give you some advice and guidance about what you should do. And so please, if you do feel like you need more information after this session, that's a great place to go to make an appointment to speak to someone one-on-one. The law that we work with at the Human Rights Clinic is called the BC Human Rights Code. It protects people in BC from discrimination. It's really important to know that the BC Human Rights Code really only applies to discrimination. It doesn't protect those larger human rights that many of us think of when we think of human rights, like, you know, a right to education or the right to housing, the right to clean, safe drinking water. These are rights, they're human rights, but the Human Rights Code applies to a very narrow subset of the things we think of as human rights. The Human Rights Code applies to discrimination and protects us from discrimination in three main areas of our daily lives. It protects us from discrimination in our jobs or in trying to get a job. It protects us from discrimination in our housing situations as tenants or residents of a co-op or a strata. And it protects us from discrimination in our access to services and facilities that are publicly available. So things like businesses and stores and transit systems and healthcare all need to be provided in a non-discriminatory way under BC's Human Rights Code. The code does also protect us from discrimination in the context of unions and professional associations, as well as discriminatory or hateful publications. But those don't come up too often. So I tend to focus on the three main areas of daily life. I see this question from Ryan in the chat about getting a recording of the meeting later. I don't have that information. I do believe that the presentation is being recorded, but I will have to leave it to others from Connectra or otherwise to let us know about how the recording will be provided. So the basics then are that the Human Rights Code protects us from discrimination in these three main areas of daily life. And what we mean by discrimination in human rights law is treating someone badly, treating someone differently in a negative way on the basis of what's called a protected characteristic. And we'll see the list of protected characteristics in a moment. These are aspects of our identities, of who we are, that we shouldn't be treated differently or badly on the basis of. Treating someone badly on the basis of a protected characteristic is sometimes called direct discrimination. A second kind of discrimination that is especially important when we're thinking about disability are policies or practices that make life worse, that create barriers or difficulties for some people because of their protected characteristic. So, you know, a ramp of stairs up to an apartment's front door, that's not directly treating someone badly because they have a disability, but it is a kind of practice or situation that creates a barrier for someone with mobility limitations who cannot climb those stairs. They are prevented from equal access to their home. And a situation like that can also be discrimination. That's what we call indirect discrimination, where it's not quite so obvious that someone's being targeted intentionally on the basis of a protected characteristic, but the impact of the situation is to create a disadvantage or a barrier. And these are the characteristics, the aspects of our identities that we are protected from discrimination on the basis of. So you can see that it's all sorts of aspects of who we are, mainly things that we can't change about ourselves. and things that can be stigmatized in society. Disabilities, sexual orientations, gender identity, these are aspects of identity that people are sometimes stereotyped, stigmatized, otherwise treated badly on the basis of. And what the Human Rights Code says is that it is a violation of the law to treat people badly on the basis of these things in those protected areas that we saw a moment ago, in the workplace, in housing, or in access to services and facilities. So to make a human rights complaint, to make a successful human rights complaint, what a complainant will have to prove is that they've experienced some kind of negative treatment or negative impact. They've been prevented from accessing their home. They have been singled out and excluded in some way. They've been harassed, they've been fired, they've been evicted, they've been profiled. Some kind of negative treatment or negative impact. Second, they have to prove, a complainant has to prove that that negative treatment or impact was connected to one or more protected characteristics. Prevented from accessing their front door because the stairs create a barrier related to their disability, or they were profiled at a shopping center based on their race, or they were evicted because the landlord learned of their sexual orientation. There always has to be a connection back to one or more of those protected characteristics a moment ago. And then third, it has to have happened in a protected area. So sometimes we know discrimination happens, while people are waiting for the bus or walking down the street or getting into their car. Someone might make a racist comment or a homophobic joke. Unfortunately, that kind of discrimination is not covered by the Human Rights Code because it didn't happen in a protected area. It didn't happen in someone's employment or in their housing context or in their access to a service. So that connection between the protected characteristic and the negative treatment is also really crucial. There has to be discrimination, there has to be some evidence to connect the negative treatment or negative impact to a protected characteristic. That could be sometimes the hardest part of the human rights complaint. Someone might get, not hired for the job and not really know why and think maybe it was because of their race or their disability. Proving that it was can be challenging. It's going to depend on all of the evidence. And it's also possible that a respondent who the human rights complaint is against, an employer, landlord, etc., they might be able to justify that negative treatment or negative impact and show that it was reasonable and defensible in the situation. Human rights complaints get made to the BC Human Rights Tribunal. The tribunal is like a court that hears and decides human rights complaints. So that's all they do. The Human Rights Tribunal just deals with human rights complaints where a complainant alleges they've been discriminated against contrary to the Human Rights Code. So I say they're like a court. They're not exactly a court. They're what's called an administrative tribunal. And all that means is that while they follow many of the same court procedures, they're less formal and a little more flexible. But they're like a court in the sense that there would be an independent decision maker, like a judge, who hears all of the evidence. They hear testimony under oath given by the witnesses. They consider documents and any other relevant evidence. And then they make a decision, either finding in the complainant's favor that yes, discrimination has occurred, or finding in the respondent's favor that any treatment was justified or there's a non-discriminatory explanation. If the tribunal agrees with the complainant that discrimination has occurred, if the complainant proves their case, then they can order compensation and other remedies for the discrimination. Let's say someone was terminated from their job for a discriminatory reason. Let's say they announced they were pregnant and the employer terminated them. That would be discrimination on the basis of sex. And if they were successful in proving that, then maybe the tribunal would order the respondent, their former employer, to pay them some lost wages, because but for the discrimination, the complainant would have continued working for many months, and instead they were unemployed and lost out on a bunch of income. The tribunal could order the former employer to pay them back for what they should have earned. The tribunal can also order compensation for what's called injury to dignity, feelings, and self-respect. And injury to dignity awards are meant to compensate a person who's being discriminated against for the impact that discrimination had on them. Kind of like a pain and suffering award. Discrimination hurts people's dignity, and it is something that a respondent, again, might have to compensate them for the impact of that discriminatory treatment. The tribunal can also order more what we sometimes call systemic remedies. If the barrier a person is experiencing is stairs up to their apartment, maybe the tribunal would order the landlord to build a ramp. Or if the human rights complaint was about racial harassment and bullying in the workplace, maybe the tribunal orders that employer to provide training and develop a policy on workplace racism to try to prevent the situation from happening again. So the tribunal can order both those more individual type remedies like compensation, but also more big picture remedies that try to prevent the situation from occurring again in the future. One great thing about the Human Rights Tribunal that makes it very different than a court is that it's free. It's totally free to file a human rights complaint. There's no filing fee. There's no fee for hearing days. The whole process is totally free. There's also our free legal assistance available to some people. And that is a huge benefit, of course, of the human rights complaints process. It's free to access. The tribunal also offers free mediation services, which are a huge help in many cases. The tribunal has a number of trained mediators on its team that they can assign to help the parties to a human rights complaint have a discussion, negotiate a resolution of the complaint together. And many human rights complaints get resolved through mediation. Settlements are really common, and they can often be a much quicker and better way of getting to a resolution, as opposed to going all the way through to a hearing where you have to prove your case. Mediations are an opportunity to look for a solution that works for everybody. The last thing I want to mention about making a human rights complaint is the 1-year limitation period. You only have 1 year to file a human rights complaint after the date of the thing that you say is discrimination. So that can be a challenge for some folks to meet that 1-year limitation period, but it is really important and pretty strictly enforced. The tribunal has a bit of discretion. If a complaint is filed a little bit past the 1-year limitation period, but not much, and they may not accept a complaint for filing if it's filed even 1 day past the limitation period. So really important to know that thinking about making a human rights complaint or a situation arises down the road, remembering that 1-year limitation period is quite crucial. To just close out the presentation, I wanted to just share a few examples of human rights cases that these are based on real cases, and these are situations where a complainant has been successful in proving discrimination. And I've used the first example a couple of times already as I've been speaking. A tenant who's elderly and uses a wheelchair and needs a ramp up to her front door. In a case that our office worked on, the landlord had refused to build a ramp. They said it was too expensive and difficult for them to do. And our client was unable to come and go from her home. She was basically a prisoner in her own home. She couldn't leave independently. It was a huge barrier to her equality and ability to go about her life. And our office was successful in proving that that was discrimination. The landlord had failed to accommodate her disability-related needs, and the landlord was ordered to take the steps necessary to get the ramp built. And the landlord was also ordered to compensate our client for injury to her dignity for the many, many years that she had been a prisoner in her own home due to their failure to take action. In another case, our office didn't work on this case, but it's an interesting one to share. The university student was deaf, and throughout her medical school, she'd been provided with sign language interpretation. She was a med student, but when it came time for her to do her residency portion of her education, the university refused to continue to provide the sign language interpreter. Again, they claimed that it was very costly and they shouldn't have to do it. And she made many efforts to provide them with ideas and options and opportunities to get grants and different funding sources for the sign language interpretation. She worked very hard to try to get the university to accommodate her disability-related needs. Unfortunately, they refused, so she had to take them to the Human Rights Tribunal, where she was successful. And what the tribunal found in that case was that the university had not shown that the cost was so high that it would be what's called in human rights law an undue hardship. It wouldn't have been an undue hardship for the university to provide the sign language interpretation that she needed for her residency, and its failure to do so was discrimination. This is a little bit of a just more sort of general example, but an employee with an anxiety disorder and depression might miss work because of her disabilities. Mental health issues are considered disabilities under the Human Rights Code. And if someone misses work because they're hospitalized due to their mental health issues and their employer terminates them for missing work, that could well be discrimination. An employer has a duty to accommodate a person with a disability and disability-related needs, and that would likely include giving them some time off to recover and get themselves well enough to return to work. Final example here, a worker gets injured and can no longer do some of his job duties, and the employer fires him without exploring any alternatives. So someone being injured may be a disability. If the injury is just temporary or not that serious, it might not qualify or count as a disability for the Human Rights Code purposes. But if it's serious and persistent, then it will be considered a disability. And again, the employer has a duty to accommodate to the point of undue hardship. They have to take some steps to see if the person can be accommodated. Maybe they can be retrained for a different position or given some different duties while they're injured. And so the fact that the employer here fired this person without exploring any alternatives means that they've likely discriminated on the basis of discrimination because they haven't made any efforts to accommodate the worker's disabilities. So just some examples of the kinds of cases that we see. Complaints to the Human Rights Tribunal about disability are by far the most common of all of the protected characteristics that we saw in that big list a few minutes ago. Disability is by far the most common allegation of discrimination at the tribunal. So very lastly, I just wanted to share a list of a few resources for legal help on human rights cases and issues. I think, our clinic it's our bread and butter. It's what we do. We are, I would say, I know I'm biased, but I would say we're the #1 place to go for human rights related questions and issues. But there are some other service providers as well. Each of the 3 law schools in BC has a student clinic that can help with human rights issues. There's a great organization called Amici Curiae. It's a Latin phrase for friends of court. They provide help to people wanting help filling out the complaint form. Access Pro Bono is a great resource, and PovNet is a place that has a great database of advocates and service providers around the province. So it's a really good one to go and have a look at if you're not based in the Lower Mainland and looking for what's out there in another part of the province. PovNet's Find an Advocate service is a really helpful one. So I promised I would wrap up at about the half-hour point so that we could take some questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if anybody has any questions. Lena Wu.
Yes.
You have a question? You've raised your hand.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Right now I'm living in a disability housing, and our landlord, they park the office cars in our underground parking. And right now, many tenants, they are put on the waiting list for the parking spot. I just want to ask, is this a kind of discrimination? Because I parked my car on the street, and one day my car encountered a hit and run. The mirror was hit by somebody, and I paid for more. The total cost more than $900. ICBC paid. I have to pay $500 deductible. Then the balance paid by the ICBC. So I just want to know is if my landlord can park the office cars in our resident parking lots.
Well, Lena, I mentioned earlier that I can't give legal advice in a workshop like this, but I can give legal information, and I can remind all of us of what someone has to show to make a human rights complaint. You have to show a negative impact that has a connection to your protected characteristics. So if your protected characteristic is your disability, you have to show how you're experiencing a negative impact because of your disability. How your disability is a factor in the negative thing that the landlord is doing and how it's affecting you. So, based on what you've shared, it doesn't quite sound like that would be the case. But again, the most critical thing to know about a human rights case is the importance of showing that you're experiencing a disability-related barrier or negative impact or negative treatment. That connection to your protected characteristic is really important.
Okay, I see.
Does anyone else have a question? Again, not a question about a situation that you're experiencing that tends to cross the line into legal advice that I cannot provide in a workshop like this, but any clarifying question about anything that I've shared, anything that didn't make sense or that you'd like more information about? Brenda, do you have a question? I see that you've come off mute. Maybe not. Anyone with a question about how human rights are protected, how you might make a complaint or get more information or guidance? Oh, Brenda, your mic isn't working. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. You want to take a moment to type your question in the chat? Take your time. Oh, Brenda. Just while we're waiting for Brenda to type her question, Kausar, I think I am understanding that some folks might be watching this on YouTube, and if you see any questions getting posted in the chat there, maybe you could just let us know.
Your voice is like going away slowly.
My voice is fading away?
Yeah, now it's fine.
Okay, sorry about that. I was just saying, I think I'm understanding that this presentation is also being broadcast on YouTube.
Yeah.
And if anybody is asking questions over on the YouTube link, if there's anything in the chat there or comments, or I'm not totally sure how that works, but maybe you could just let us know.
Yeah, I think so far. And it's in YouTube also, and on Facebook also, it's been live streamed.
I see. Okay, so yeah, please let me know if there are questions coming through on YouTube or on Facebook, and I'm happy to try to answer them.
Sure, but there is nothing so far.
Maybe while Brenda is typing, I can share a little bit more information. Oh no, here's Brenda's question. I've dealt with the tribunal around the person living below me, complaining about the sound of my wheelchair. I had to get my floors insulated and replaced. The strata had to cover the cost of my accommodation and the flooring as well as the installation. I had to contribute $500 towards a $20,000 cost incurred by the strata. Yeah, oftentimes accommodations are, expenses that the strata have to provide. And don't live in a strata, so you all might know more about how this works than I do, but my understanding is that every owner has to contribute some funds to the common pool of money that provides for those accommodations. So the expense gets shared around in that way. Yeah, accommodations certainly can be costly in some circumstances, and cost can be an undue hardship in some cases, but it really depends on all of the evidence that's presented. You know, I could imagine a case where the cost of building a ramp, for example, could be an undue hardship, perhaps if the strata, you know, had no money in its reserve account and the residents were very low income, and the levy that was going to be required in order to fund the building of a ramp was something that the residents simply couldn't afford. Maybe that would be an undue hardship, in which case the tribunal would say, okay, that's too much. It's not reasonable to expect the strata to cover that in this situation. But it's really going to require evidence to say this is just, it's too unreasonable, it's too much, it's more than can reasonably be done. And thank you, Ebby, for letting me know about my voice. I'm sorry about that. I'll make sure I keep leaning forward. Are there any other questions or comments? Maybe just to give folks a couple more minutes in case they are thinking of anything, or maybe there's something coming through on YouTube or Facebook. I'll just share some exceptions, some important exceptions in the Human Rights Code. One important thing to know about the Human Rights Code is that it's aimed at preventing disadvantage and discrimination and negative treatment and negative impacts on protected groups. And the purpose of the Human Rights Code is to, in some ways, address historic unfairnesses and inequalities and disadvantage that different groups have experienced. And some of the ways that the Human Rights Code tries to do that are, number one, by allowing nonprofit organizations to prioritize the needs of their members. And so if there's, let's say, an advocacy organization that works on behalf of people with disabilities, and they decide that when they hire a new advocate, they're going to only hire a person with a disability. That's allowed. That is 100% allowed for that nonprofit organization to do. It's not discrimination. It's not a violation of the code to prioritize the needs of the population that a nonprofit serves. And so if an able-bodied or non-disabled person applied for that job and they didn't get it, they could not make a claim of discrimination on that basis. Or, you can imagine lots of other examples of nonprofits prioritizing the needs of the people they serve. An Indigenous serving organization that works with Indigenous communities and families, they might only hire Indigenous people to work there, and that's okay. Or a women's shelter that only hires women to work at the shelter. So those kinds of things are allowed. It's also allowed for an employer to implement an employment equity program. And an employment equity program is an initiative, like I've mentioned, that tries to address historic discrimination and sort of ongoing patterns of exclusion and disadvantage. So for example, we know that people with disabilities have faced a lot of discrimination and disadvantage in employment and in workplaces over many years. And so if an employer decided, I want to address that, I want to do a targeted hiring of people with disabilities, That again would likely be allowed under the Human Rights Code because it is a plan to address underrepresentation and disadvantage and discrimination that has gone before, or a university that has long excluded racialized people and wants to make sure it is hiring more inclusively and decides they want to designate a new position for an Indigenous person, for example. That again wouldn't be a violation of the Human Rights Code. It's not discrimination because it's aimed at trying to rebalance the scales and bring about fairness in a situation where there's been long unfairness. Just wanted to add that additional piece of information. Well, not seeing any other. Oh, Sheena has a question. Sheena, I'm sorry, that is a question that I cannot answer. Human rights doesn't necessarily intersect with situations involving the public trustee and guardian. I don't know that our clinic can assist you with that question. I mentioned Access Pro Bono as a resource. They have lawyers that do work in all sorts of different areas, and there might be somebody there that could assist you with a problem that it sounds like you're having with the public guardian and trustee, but I'm afraid I can't answer that. Not seeing any other questions or hearing that there's anything on Facebook or YouTube. I think I can conclude my presentation on human rights and on our clinic and the services that we provide. It sounds like this presentation's been recorded, so you are able to check back if there was a piece of information that you missed. And otherwise, I wish you all the best. Have a great rest of your day and week.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome.